Welcome, dear viewers. Tonight, step quietly into the shadows of history, into chambers where crowns gleamed like stars, but the women forced to wear them lived in a darkness deeper than any night. Imagine the sound of silk brushing against stone floors, the echo of whispered orders behind throne, and the quiet sob of a queen who realizes the crown on her brow is nothing more than a shining cage. Because for many wives of kings, power was never a promise. It was a sentence, a lifelong confinement behind golden doors, a slow, suffocating descent into loneliness, humiliation, fear, and forgotten suffering. Tonight, we begin their story, a story kingdoms tried to bury, a story palaces wished to erase. The world remembers the crowns, the courts, the marble palaces where torches glimmered like captured suns, but it forgets the quiet screams of the women trapped inside them. Kingly marriages were celebrated as alliances, triumphs, and the merging of powerful bloodlines. But for the women who entered these gilded arenas, marriage was never about love. It was a transaction, a negotiation, a political weapon disguised in lace, jewels, and vows spoken before God. They weren't wives. They were offerings, pieces on a board moved by fathers, uncles, bishops, and generals. From the moment a royal daughter was born, her life was pre-written. Her cradle was placed beside treaties, her future sealed by signatures from men she would never meet. If her kingdom needed allies, she became a diplomatic gift. If her father sought land, she was the bargaining chip. If her nation needed peace, she was the human guarantee. The crown on her head didn't elevate her. It confined her, held her in place, marked her as valuable, but not valued. Across continents, across centuries, the story was eerily similar. In Europe, a king's wife was expected to produce heirs and remain silent. In Asia, she navigated labyrinths of consorts, concubines, and rival queens who would poison a cup or strangle a maid to protect their place. In the Middle East, she could be veiled, hidden, or guarded by men with curved swords whose loyalty shifted with every whisper at court. In Africa, she might be surrounded by spiritual lineage and warrior queens, but still treated as a political seal, bound to a throne she never chose. It didn't matter where the palace stood, the rules were always written by men, and the punishments for breaking them were always written in agony.
Imagine the first night. A young princess arrived in her new kingdom. She had traveled for days or weeks in a carriage stuffed with chests of gold, fine fabrics, and ceremonial gifts meant to impress her husband's court. The people cheered for her, not because they loved her, but because she represented peace, prosperity, or a merger of dynasties. She smiled because she was ordered to. She walked gracefully because eyes examined every movement. She spoke softly because she was told queens must never reveal the weight in their hearts. Inside her new palace, she found herself surrounded by courtiers who measured her worth like merchants assessing silk. Some sought her favor, some sought her downfall. Every maid might be a spy. Every servant might belong to another faction. Every kind word might hide a poisoned dagger. And her husband, the king, could treat her with devotion or indifference or cruelty without consequence. The marriage bed became both her throne and her battlefield. If she produced a son, she gained temporary power. If she produced a daughter, she prayed the king did not see it as a personal failure. Some kings celebrated their wives only when heirs were born. Others ignored them in favor of lovers, concubines, or favorite courtiers who wielded more influence than queens themselves. The torture these wives endured rarely involved iron chains or dungeon walls. No, this was torture made elegant, acceptable, and invisible. It looked like a feast where the queen sat beside her husband while he publicly flirted with another woman. A palace decree denying her the right to speak to foreign envoys. A cold dismissal when she asked for time with her own children. A whispered rumor planted by a rival that she practiced witchcraft. A locked chamber door while courtiers voted to strip her of titles. The world outside saw pearls, diamonds, embroidered gowns. But behind the closed doors of a royal bedchamber, a queen might cry into her pillows knowing she was trapped in a life she could never escape. Not by law, not by religion, not by society. Some tried to rebel quietly. Some kept journals hidden behind loose stones. Some formed clandestine alliances with mistresses, maids, or marginalized servants. Some carved a small piece of freedom by learning languages, studying politics, or secretly influencing ambassadors.
But others, the forgotten ones, dwindled until they were mere shadows wandering palace corridors. There were queens who slowly lost their minds under the weight of isolation. Queens who were beaten in ways no record dared admit. Queens whose deaths were disguised as fevers, accidents, or God's will. Queens who were buried without names because history loves kings but forgets their wives. Consider the girl who married a king twice her age, who trembled on her wedding night as he lifted her veil with hands that had already held many women. Consider the princess sent to a foreign kingdom where she couldn't speak the language, her letters home censored, her tears unnoticed by servants taught never to acknowledge a queen's weakness. Consider the wife who smiled beside her husband at coronations, even as he ordered her family's execution for political convenience. These were the silent tortures, the ones historians gloss over, the ones poets never sang of, the ones done in the privacy of palaces where no witnesses existed but marble walls and trembling candles. In many ways, the crown itself was the instrument of torment, a beautiful trap, a symbol of duty that swallowed personal identity, a weapon used to bind women to lives they did not choose. Queens were expected to be obedient, yet wise, fertile, yet pure, graceful, yet invisible, powerful, yet powerless. It was a contradiction no mortal woman could bear without suffering. This first chapter opens the door, just a crack, into the dark reality behind royal marriages. But in the chapters ahead, we will step deeper into the lives of individual women whose tragedies became legend. Women who were humiliated by kings who should have honored them. Women who were killed by husbands who vowed to protect them. Women who were sacrificed in the name of monarchy. Tonight we begin their resurrection, not as footnotes to great kings, not as forgotten brides, not as political pawns, but as the central figures of their own stories. Because the tortured wives of kings deserve to be remembered not for their crowns, but for the courage it took to survive them. The wind that swept across medieval France carried whispers of destiny, but none were darker than the fate awaiting the young princess born into the house of Capet. Isabelle of France entered the world surrounded by silk canopies, jeweled cradles, and the finest Tudors of Europe. Yet even as a child, she understood that her life was never her own. She was the daughter of a king, valuable, desirable, and dangerously useful. Every smile she offered in court was a potential alliance. Every step she took was watched. Every word she spoke traveled further than she ever could. And when she turned 12, her destiny was sealed with a royal decree. She would marry the King of England. To the people of France, this was a triumph. Peace, they said, stability, unity between nations long drenched in blood. But to Isabelle, the words marriage and crown felt like a stone settling on her chest. She had never known England. She had never seen its rugged hills or heard its language spoken by common tongues. Yet now she was expected to leave everything familiar, her mother, her siblings, her homeland, and enter a nation where her presence would be dissected by nobles hungry for power. Still, queens were not allowed fear. Queens were not allowed hesitation. Queens were meant to smile, bow, and walk forward into the night. When Isabelle first met Edward II, she truly tried to be the wife she had been groomed to be. She was intelligent, diplomatic, and well-trained in the art of courtly charm. But from the moment she stepped into the English palace, she sensed something wrong, something out of place, something watching her from behind velvet curtains and carved pillars. It was not Edward's coldness that struck her most deeply. It was his absence. For the king who should have stood proudly beside his new bride was often found in the company of another man, Piers Gaveston. Handsome, charismatic, and brazenly bold in ways few courtiers dared to be, Gaveston stood too close, smiled too intimately, and wielded a power that unsettled even the most seasoned nobles. The English lords despised him. The French delegation whispered about him. And Isabelle, young, hopeful, and newly crowned, realized her heart was already taken. Her wedding night passed like a distant dream. Her crown lost its shine within days, and her bedchamber became a quiet prison. She lay awake night after night, unable to sleep, her thoughts circling the same hopeless truth. She had been brought here not for companionship, not for respect, but for breeding. Her emotions were irrelevant, her happiness disposable, her presence symbolic. The English queen was expected to remain silent, but Isabelle's silence was carved from pain. Gaveston strutted through the palace with the authority of a king. He mocked nobles, ignored protocol, and treated Isabelle as though she were nothing more than a decorative fixture. During ceremonies, he wore jewels that rivaled hers. During feasts, he accepted gifts meant for the royal couple. He even dared to call the queen by belittling nicknames, insults spoken with a smug grin, while Isabelle maintained the poise expected of her. At first, she endured it. She smiled when she wished to scream. She bowed when she wished to strike him across the face. But the humiliation chipped away at her spirit, night by night, until sleep became impossible. The whispers in the corridors, the laughter behind closed doors, the king's indifference, it all swirled together into a torment that left her pacing the cold stone floors of her chambers until dawn. Queen by title, servant by reality. The English crown was heavier than she had ever imagined. When Gaveston was finally exiled by enraged barons, Isabelle dared to hope that her marriage might become something real. But Edward's grief did not soften his heart toward her. Instead, he blamed her, blamed France, blamed politics, blamed anyone but himself. His anger struck her not with blows, but with cutting words and frigid silences. When Gaveston returned, Edward celebrated as though a part of his soul had been restored. Isabelle understood then. She was the outsider in her own marriage. And yet, the queen's suffering did not end with humiliation. It evolved. When Gaveston met his brutal death at the hands of rebellious nobles, Edward found a new favorite, Hugh Despenser. He was colder, more calculating, more dangerous. If Gaveston's influence was a scandal, Despenser's was a tyranny.
He took Isabel's lands, her income, her authority. He stripped away her household servants and replaced them with his own spies. Her letters were intercepted, her movements restricted, her alliances monitored. She did not sleep because she could not. Every hour of darkness carried the threat of some new betrayal. Her children, her only comfort, were used as pawns, moved from one castle to another under Despensier's orders. The queen was kept isolated, powerless, and subjected to a quiet, suffocating cruelty that the court pretended not to see.
But a woman pushed into a corner does not always break. Sometimes she sharpens. Isabelle began to observe, to listen, to memorize the cracks in the empire her husband refused to see. And when she was sent to France on a diplomatic mission, a mission meant to remove her from political affairs, she made a choice no queen had dared to make before. She refused to return. She aligned herself with enemies of the English crown. She formed bonds with nobles who despised Despenser's tyranny. She found strength in the freedom she never knew she had. And there, across the sea from the man who had forsaken her, Isabelle shed her role as the sorrowful queen. She became something new, something powerful, something feared. The English would later call her the she-wolf of France. But wolves do not emerge from peaceful lives. They are forged in suffering. Isabelle's rebellion was not born from ambition. It was born from torment, from sleepless nights, from the cold sting of humiliation, from a marriage that chained her heart and strangled her spirit. Her uprising would reshape England. Her vengeance would dethrone a king. Her legacy would echo through centuries. But before she became a warrior queen, she was simply a young woman, lying awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling of a foreign palace, wondering how a crown could imprison her so completely. The story of Anne Boleyn does not begin with a crown. It begins with a spark so bright it threatened to set an entire kingdom ablaze. Before she was queen, before her name was etched into the blood-stained pages of English history, Anne was simply a woman who dared to lift her eyes to a king. In a world ruled by men, this was an act of courage. In a world ruled by Henry VIII, it was an act of fate. She arrived at court not as a temptress, not as a seductress, but as a cultured, intelligent young woman molded by the elegance of French society. She spoke boldly. She dressed with a grace that drew the eye. She carried herself with the sharp wit of someone who understood the game of power and, more importantly, how to survive it. But Henry
Did not simply notice her. He became consumed. Here was a woman who did not swoon, who did not beg, who did not fall to her knees in grateful admiration, and refused him, politely, carefully, but firmly. She would not be another mistress, another fleeting pleasure in the king's endless parade of conquests. If Henry wanted her, he would have to offer something far more dangerous than passion. He would have to offer her a crown. And so began the great unraveling of England. For 6 long years, Henry tore apart the foundations of his kingdom to have her. Popes were defied, churches were divided, friendships were broken beyond repair, all for one woman whom he elevated, praised, and adored with an obsession that bordered on madness. Anne became the sun around which England rotated. Songs were written about her. Jewels were crafted in her image. Henry carved their initials into trees as if he were a lovesick boy, not the ruler of a burgeoning empire. But the higher a woman was lifted by a king's adoration, the further she would fall when that love soured. When Anne finally accepted Henry's hand, she did so knowing that her position was fragile, perilous, and dependent entirely on something she could not control, her ability to produce a son.
Queens across the world were forced into this brutal expectation, but few faced it under the glare of an entire nation that had been reshaped in their name. Anne's first pregnancy ended with the birth of a daughter, Elizabeth, a brilliant, fiery child, yet not the son Henry demanded. Still, the king tried to maintain his devotion, for a time. But devotion was not in Henry's nature. Desire was, possession was, disappointment was. Anne found herself caught in the narrow space between worship and disdain, a space every royal wife dreaded. Each miscarriage, each failed attempt to secure an heir, chipped away at her safety. The court watched her like vultures perched on battlements, waiting for her to stumble, waiting for her to give them reason to tear her apart. And stumble she did, not through sin, but through the boldness that had once made her irresistible. She spoke too freely, she argued too fiercely, she played the political game without apology. In a world where queens were expected to be silent ornaments, Anne dared to be a force.
But Henry wanted passion only when it pleased him. He wanted fire only when it warmed him. And when that fire burned too brightly, he declared it dangerous. Thomas Cromwell, the king's calculating minister, could read Henry's heart the way a sailor reads storms on the horizon. He saw the king's fading affection and moved swiftly to ensure that he, not Anne, remained in Henry's good graces. For Cromwell, Anne was no longer a queen. She was an obstacle, and obstacles were meant to be removed. Whispers began to seep through the court like poison through velvet. Anne had lovers. Anne bewitched the king. Anne sought to murder him. Anne was a traitor. The accusations were absurd, so absurd that even those who despised her whispered disbelief. But in a kingdom built on the whims of one man, truth mattered far less than convenience. The queen was arrested on May 2nd, 1536, dragged from her chambers, stripped of jewels, stripped of titles, stripped of dignity. As she walked through the Tower of London gates, she remembered her coronation just 3 years earlier, how the crowds cheered, how Henry looked at her as if she were the greatest treasure God had ever created. Now she was nothing. Now she was alone. Now she was the target of a king's wrath. Her trial was a spectacle, a farce dressed in legal robes. Men she had once trusted testified against her. Her own brother was accused of unspeakable acts. The verdict had been decided before she even entered the hall. Anne Boleyn was sentenced to death, not by burning. Henry granted her the mercy of a swift execution by sword. A French swordsman was summoned, famed for his precision. It was meant to be clean, dignified, as if murder could ever be dignified.
On the morning of May 19, Anne walked to the scaffold with the grace she had carried all her life. The sun was bright, the air was still. Every eye in the crowd fixed on her as she knelt, her long, dark hair tucked away to expose the pale column of her neck. She prayed. She forgave. She waited. The sword that ended her life also ended Henry's greatest obsession. But it did not end Anne's legacy. Her daughter would one day rule England as Elizabeth I, one of the greatest monarchs in history. And Anne's name, though stained with false accusations, would become a symbol of ambition, boldness, and the deadly cost of loving a king. Anne Boleyn was not destroyed by her sins. She was destroyed by her crown. For in Henry's England, a queen's power was an illusion, and her life depended on the king's ever-changing desire. In the heart of Russia's frozen empire, where winters bit deep into bone and palaces glittered like ice-bound fortresses, power was not merely taken, it was consumed.
and no ruler devoured power more ruthlessly than Ivan IV, the man history remembers as Ivan the Terrible. His court was a labyrinth of shadows, betrayal, and whispered plots. No one walked those halls without fear. No one slept without uncertainty. And certainly, no woman married into the royal household without risking her life. In such a world, the fate of Marfa Sobakina was already carved long before she placed her feet inside the Kremlin. She was not born into royalty. She was not raised for a crown. Marfa was the daughter of a merchant, educated, gentle, and known for her beauty across the villages that stretched along the Volga River. Her life was meant to be simple: a quiet marriage, a modest home, and perhaps a future surrounded by children and market stalls. But Ivan had other plans. After the death of his beloved first wife, Anastasia, a death he believed came from poisoning, Ivan fell into madness and suspicion. Every courtier, every noble, every servant became a potential assassin in his eyes. He trusted no one, loved no one, and yet he demanded a new bride. Not for companionship, but to produce heirs who could carry his ruthless legacy. Thus began the infamous bride show, an unnerving ritual where hundreds of young women were brought to court to be examined like livestock, their beauty judged, their health scrutinized, their voices tested for signs of hidden illness or weakness. Ivan's physicians and advisors poked and prodded them, searching for the perfect vessel for the Tsar's future sons. It was in this chilling parade of innocence that Marfa's fate sealed itself.
Ivan saw her, and something in him softened. She was quiet, but bright, fragile, but strong in spirit. Unlike the noble women who fought for status, Marfa walked with humility, her eyes lowered, her words gentle. Perhaps it was this softness, this purity, untouched by court politics, that drew the Tsar's gaze. In a world where everyone schemed, Marfa seemed honest. She was chosen. She became the future Tsarina of Russia. But not all rejoiced. Behind smiling faces, jealousy struck like a venomous serpent. The noble families whose daughters had been rejected simmered with hatred. They whispered curses in the shadows, their pride wounded by the rise of a merchant's girl. Some swore Ivan had insulted the aristocracy by choosing a bride of a lower birth. Others murmured that Marfa's simplicity would be swallowed whole by the brutal machinery of the Kremlin. In the weeks that followed her selection, Marfa felt the palace closing in around her. The ceilings seemed too high, the corridors too long, the chandeliers too bright. Servants watched her with cold interest. Noble women followed her steps with narrowed eyes. Every smile felt like a lie, every courtesy a test. But it was not court cruelty that brought her downfall. It was something far more sinister. Only days after her betrothal was announced, Marfa fell ill. It began with weakness, trembling hands, faint breaths, sleepless nights filled with strange dreams. Then came the stomach pains, the sudden loss of color in her cheeks, the way her vision blurred as though a veil had been pulled over her eyes. Ivan was horrified. This could not happen again, not after Anastasia. He summoned healers from every corner of Russia. Orthodox priests prayed over her. Physicians forced bitter medicines down her throat. Even alchemists tried their questionable remedies, whispering in frightened tones as her body grew frailer. Yet nothing helped. Marfa was dying.
Rumors spread like wildfire. She had been poisoned. Someone wanted her gone before she wore the crown. Someone wished to strike at Ivan by killing the woman he had chosen. The timing was too perfect. The symptoms too familiar. The motives too plentiful.
And still, Ivan pushed forward with the wedding. Marfa Sobakina was crowned Tsarina of Russia while barely able to stand. Her crown shimmered like frost on her pale brow. Her wedding robes hung loosely on her thinning frame. As chants echoed through the cathedral, she swayed under the weight of jewels meant for a living queen. Witnesses later said she looked less like a bride and more like a ghost. For 2 weeks after the wedding, Marfa withered. Ivan, torn between rage and grief, visited her chambers, demanding answers from terrified servants and healers who could offer none. He roared through corridors like a wounded beast, convinced the boyars had poisoned her, convinced that treachery lurked in every corner. He was not wrong, but justice would come too late. Marfa Sobakina, Tsarina for only 16 days, slipped away quietly. No war trumpets sounded, no bells tolled for her passing. She died surrounded not by warmth or comfort, but by fear, confusion, and the cold echo of Ivan's footsteps pacing outside her chamber. Her death shattered the last fragile thread of sanity the Tsar possessed. Ivan unleashed a storm of torture upon the nobles, a purge born from paranoia and grief. Dozens were killed, hundreds exiled, entire families erased from records. The Oprichnina, his dreaded political terror machine, grew more violent, more monstrous. Fueled by the belief that Marfa's death had been an attack on the very heart of Russia. But history remembers her differently. Marfa was not a strategist, not a schemer, not a player in the deadly game of power. She was a young woman forced into a role she never asked for, torn from her peaceful life and thrust into a world where ambition was a weapon, and she became the first casualty. She was chosen for her beauty, praised for her purity, and then punished simply for existing. A bride crowned in agony, a queen who lived only to die, a symbol of innocence crushed beneath the boots of a merciless throne. Marfa Sobakina is a reminder that in the courts of kings, the greatest dangers are not always battles or betrayals. Sometimes it is the crown itself that kills.
Welcome back to the dim corridors where power is disguised by velvet curtains, where footsteps echo like secrets, and where the soft glow of oil lamps reveals a world most of history never dared to look at closely. Tonight, we step into a palace unlike any other. A palace where women lived surrounded by unimaginable luxury, but shackled by rules sharper than any blade. A palace where love was a danger, trust was a myth, and survival was an art. Tonight, we enter the Ottoman imperial harem, the golden prison of the sultans. And at its center, we find one woman whose story remains one of the most twisted, powerful, and haunting tales in royal history, Hürrem Sultan, also known as Roxolana. She was born far from the domes and minarets of Istanbul, somewhere in the rugged lands of Eastern Europe, possibly in modern-day Ukraine. Her real name is lost to time. What survives are whispers. She was the daughter of an Orthodox priest, a girl with red hair like a flickering flame, and a spirit that refused to be extinguished. But one day, Raiders stormed her village, burned the fields, and tore her from her family's arms. She was chained, sold, and carried across seas to be auctioned like a prized jewel in the slave markets of the Ottoman Empire. And so she entered the harem, not as a chosen bride, but as property. The harem was not simply a place of beauty or pleasure. It was a political machine, a battlefield draped in silk. Every woman was both a prisoner and a competitor. Every smile could hide a knife. Every favor from the Sultan created enemies in the shadows. The women were guarded, watched, forbidden from stepping outside the palace walls. The world believed they lived a life of extravagance, but the truth was far darker. The harem was a cage made of gold. At first, Hurrem was just one among hundreds, a foreign girl, a concubine, another forgotten face among the silken veils. But something set her apart. Her intelligence, her laughter, her refusal to bow before the silent hierarchy that suffocated the others. And Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent noticed her. He, a ruler of unmatched power, conqueror of continents, a man whose name made armies tremble, was drawn to the enslaved girl who carried fire in her eyes. Hurrem did not approach him with trembling obedience or timid silence. She met him with wit, with charm, with a spark that made him feel something he hadn't felt in years. Alive. The moment he called her Hurrem, meaning the joyful one, the harem trembled, because love in that gilded cage was a declaration of war.
The first strike came from Mahidevran, Suleiman's senior consort and mother of his eldest son Mustafa. She saw Hurrem as an intruder, a threat. Rumors say the two clashed violently, that Mahidevran scratched Hurrem's face, leaving marks that forced Suleiman to intervene. But whether the story is softened or exaggerated, one truth is certain. Hurrem now had an enemy who would never forget her. But the harem was not ruled by rival consorts alone. Above them towered the formidable Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, who controlled the palace with strategic brilliance. She saw Hurrem's rise, calculated every danger it brought, and watched her with the cold precision of a hawk. For the Valide Sultan, Hurrem was not simply competition. She was a disruption to the order that had kept the empire stable. Hurrem, however, was unlike any woman the Ottoman court had ever seen. She did not merely seek survival. She sought influence. And she earned it, not through manipulation alone, but through intelligence. She learned Turkish. She studied politics. She wrote letters to foreign rulers. She became Suleiman's confidant, his friend, his partner in a way the harem had never allowed. And that was when the true torture began. Because the closer she drew to the Sultan, the more hatred followed in her shadow. She received threats hidden in embroidered cloth. She was poisoned, or nearly poisoned, by jealous rivals. Spies reported her every move. Some say curses were whispered outside her chambers at night. Others say assassins were stationed just a corridor away, waiting for the perfect moment. Her greatest torment, however, did not come from rivals. It came from motherhood. In the Ottoman world, a concubine who bore a son gained immense influence. But influence was dangerous. Every child was a potential heir. Every heir was a potential threat. And so the mothers fought not just for favor, they fought for their children's lives. Hurrem gave Suleiman several children, but with every birth came fear. She knew that Mustafa, the eldest prince and Mahidevran's son, was beloved by the army, respected by the people, and destined to become a great ruler. She also knew one bitter truth of the Ottoman succession system. Only one heir could live. Brothers were not meant to share power. They were meant to eliminate each other.
To secure the future for her sons, Hurrem had to step deeper into palace politics. She had to play a game where one wrong move meant death. Whispers swear she influenced Suleiman to distrust Mustafa, that she helped orchestrate the prince's downfall. And when Mustafa was strangled by the Janissaries on Suleiman's own orders, the empire shook. Medivran's screams echoed through the harem like a curse. The women knew then Hurrem had survived, but at a terrible cost. Despite the shadows around her, Hurrem became the first woman in Ottoman history to marry a sultan. She broke a centuries-old tradition. She walked into the palace as a slave, and she rose to become queen. But freedom did not protect her from grief. Her sons fell into rivalry. The empire trembled under plots and betrayals, and Hurrem, once the bright flame of the harem, saw her joy dim as she aged, haunted by the ghosts of the women and children whose fates were entangled with hers. In the end, she died not in chains, but in sorrow, knowing the golden world she conquered had cost countless lives, including the peace of her own soul. Hurrem Sultan remains both hero and villain, saint and sinner, victim and victor. Her story is not of simple cruelty, but of survival in a palace where love was a rarity and fear was constant. Because in the Sultan's gilded prison, even the most powerful woman in the empire was never truly free. Before her name was dragged through the filth of revolution, before the guillotine blade reflected her terrified eyes, before pamphlets turned her into a monster she never was, Marie Antoinette was simply a girl born into glittering Austrian splendor, taught to smile even when her heart trembled. She was the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa, raised not for love but for duty, sculpted like marble for one purpose, to secure peace through marriage. At 14, she was escorted across the Rhine, her childhood stripped from her at the border, literally, her Austrian clothes removed, her Austrian attendants dismissed, her identity erased in an instant. She entered France not as Marie Antoinette of Austria, but as the future Queen of France, a symbol, a sacrifice, a pretty solution to political tension. The palace at Versailles dazzled her at first. The mirrored halls, the chandeliers dripping with light, the endless gardens carved like green lace. But behind the gold, she felt the frost. Court etiquette suffocated her. Every gesture was judged, every breath watched. Nobles whispered about her foreign accent, her youthful clumsiness, her innocent laughter.
Versailles was a stage, and she was expected to perform flawlessly. Yet the greatest humiliation was not from the courtiers, it was from her husband. Louis XVI was gentle, awkward, kind-hearted, but disastrously indecisive. And worse for Marie, he was indifferent. Their marriage, the union that was supposed to bind two empires, remained cold, untouched, and empty for years. The royal bed became her torment. Every morning, the kingdom waited to hear news of consummation, as if the future of France depended on her fertility. Whispers swirled. She cannot please him. She must be barren. She is unfit for a crown. Shame draped over her like a second gown. To escape the stifling court, Marie sought refuge in pleasure, music, fashion, and the company of those who made her laugh. She was young, lonely, desperate for affection, in a palace built on deception. She spent too much. She danced too freely. She smiled too brightly. And the people,
already suspicious of her Austrian blood, sharpened their tongues. They called her Madame Deficit. They called her the Austrian whore. They blamed her for every economic crisis, every failure, every storm that hit the crops. Never mind that France was already drowning in debt. Never mind that the king's ministers created the mess. Marie Antoinette became the scapegoat. But the cruelty did not stop there. When she finally bore children, after years of pressure and public humiliation, the court mocked them too. Some claimed they weren't Louis's children. Others mocked her for spending time with them, as if motherhood were beneath a queen. Every move she made became fuel for propaganda. Newspapers printed obscene cartoons of her. Pamphlets accused her of adultery. Lampoons spread lies that scraped at her very dignity. A kingdom feasted on her suffering. Yet through it all, Marie remained resilient. She wrote letters to her family filled with longing. She tried to advise her husband, tried to navigate the storm gathering around them. But Louis, gentle Louis, was terrified of decisive action, and fear, in politics, is fatal. When the revolution erupted, the palace gates trembled beneath the screams of thousands. The queen, who once laughed over masked balls, now faced mobs clawing for her blood. Her children were ripped from her arms, her personal guards slaughtered. She, once surrounded by luxury, now huddled in cold prison cells with straw on the floor.
The people she once waved to from gilded carriages now shouted, "Let her die!" And yet, Marie Antoinette refused to break. Her torment reached a horrifying peak during her trial. She stood before the revolutionary tribunal, surrounded by men thirsty for her execution. They hurled accusations like stones: treason, espionage, exploitation, conspiracy. But then came the most monstrous charge. She was accused of committing incest with her young son. The courtroom froze. Even the revolutionaries gasped at the indecency of the claim. Marie Antoinette, exhausted, starving, grieving, looked around the room with a fire that had not yet died. And she spoke, not as a queen, but as a mother. "I appeal to all mothers here," she said. Her voice cracked. Her dignity did not. In that moment, even her enemies saw her humanity. But mercy had long been banished from France. On October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was taken to the guillotine. Her hair was cut, her hands tied, her once splendid dress replaced with a plain white shift. She stepped into the open cart, not hidden like Louis, but displayed like a trophy, as Parisians screamed for her head. Yet as she rode through the jeering crowd, something astonishing happened. Those close enough to see her face fell silent. They saw not a villain, not a monster, not a foreign parasite. They saw a woman, pale, trembling, but unbroken. At the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. "I beg your pardon," she whispered. "It was not done intentionally." Those were her final words. And then the blade fell, claiming the life of a queen who never wanted to be one. A woman destroyed not by extravagance or crime, but by politics, propaganda, and a world that refused to let her speak. Marie Antoinette's tragedy was not simply the fall of a monarch. It was the silencing of a woman who had spent her entire life trying to be heard. The Mughal Empire shimmered with the glow of marble palaces, jeweled gardens, and courts where poets recited verses that sounded like falling stars. From Kabul to Bengal, the empire stretched across landscapes rich with saffron fields, rivers that curved like silver threads, and cities carved from rose-red sandstone.
But behind the magnificent arches and towering minarets was a world hidden from public eyes, a world the emperors themselves entered only by permission. This was the Zenana, a sanctuary, a fortress, a prison. It was the world where Mughal brides and royal women lived, loved, suffered, and disappeared. To enter the Zenana was to step into a parallel universe. Though it was adorned with fountains, mosaic floors, perfumed gardens, and servants who moved like shadows, it was still a place of confinement. The outside world, its chaos, its beauty, its danger, was forbidden. Royal wives were veiled in silk, but wrapped in silence. They had jewels worth kingdoms, but no freedom. They lived surrounded by hundreds of attendants, but slept in loneliness deeper than the desert nights. The empire's destiny was shaped by emperors like Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan, but the destinies of their brides were often shaped by fear. Fear of losing power, fear of betrayal, fear of being forgotten. When Emperor Akbar expanded his empire, he did so not only with armies, but with marriages. Dozens of princesses were brought into his palace, not out of love, but out of politics. Every marriage promised peace with a kingdom, loyalty from a region, or control over a rebellious noble family. Among these brides was the famous Hira Kunwari, later known as Maryam-uz-Zamani, a Rajput princess whose wisdom and resilience made her one of the most influential Mughal queens. But for every empowered woman like her, there were countless others who faded into obscurity the moment they entered the palace walls. They arrived with dowries of gold and armies of servants, and then vanished into the labyrinth of the Zenana, their voices swallowed by the empire. Some fell into depression, some turned to spiritual devotion, some simply accepted the silence, and some, pushed too far by jealousy and politics, turned into shadows capable of cruelty.
When Prince Selim, later Emperor Jahangir, took the throne, the Zenana witnessed the rise of a woman unlike any before, Nur Jahan. Poised, intelligent, and sharp as a sword edge, she was not content to stay behind curtains. She issued imperial orders, rode elephants in royal hunts, and even minted coins in her name. But her power came with a price. The other brides despised her influence. The nobles resented her authority, and the palace seethed with silent rebellion. To be elevated so high was to walk the edge of a blade. One misstep, and the empire would gladly watch her fall. Behind Nur Jahan's political brilliance lay the suffering of countless other royal wives, whose names barely reached historical record. Women married into the Mughal dynasty found themselves trapped in a hierarchy where rank determined survival. Those who bore sons gained temporary power. Those who failed were pushed aside into dimly lit quarters, their futures forgotten. Some developed obsessions. Some carried out schemes with deadly consequences. Some simply faded until even their shadows disappeared. The Zenana was not merely a place of confinement, it was a battleground. Life inside the Zenana was not quiet. It was filled with the rustle of silk and the grinding of teeth, with flirtations masked as politics and rivalries masked as loyalty. The emperor's wives competed not just for affection, but for survival. A son meant protection. A daughter meant vulnerability. A barren womb meant danger. Poisonings took place behind brocade curtains. Spells were whispered into lamps at night. Servants changed allegiance like shifting sand dunes. Every gift from a rival wife was examined for hidden malice. No one trusted anyone, and no one dared to show fear.
Some brides of the Mughal emperors never saw their families again after marriage. Communication was limited. Life outside ceased to exist. Their identities dissolved into anonymity. There were princesses who died of grief, women who withered without sunlight, young brides who miscarried alone, their cries swallowed by stone walls, and others who died under mysterious circumstances, illnesses, accidents, or silent executions disguised as divine fate. Their graves remain unmarked, their stories buried under centuries of dust, their suffering remembered only in whispered legends. Even the most powerful emperor could not protect the women he loved. When Shah Jahan lost Mumtaz Mahal, the woman for whom he built the Taj Mahal, the Zenana descended into mourning, so deep it swallowed joy for decades. Mumtaz died giving birth to her 14th child, a reminder of the brutal expectations placed on royal wives. Motherhood was not tender in the Mughal court. It was duty. It was danger. It was a race to produce heirs before rivalry devoured you. Mumtaz's death revealed the harsh truth. Even the most cherished queen could not escape the suffering written into her destiny. What makes the stories of Mughal wives so haunting is not just the palace politics or the jealousy, it is the silence, the forced quiet. The way history remembers emperors with marble mausoleums, glittering crowns, armies, and poets, while the women who bore their children, healed their wounds, comforted their fears, and suffered in solitude, remain shadows. Their tears stained the same marble that tourists admire today. Their footsteps echoed in the courtyards where pigeons now gather. Their pain seeped into the stone, unseen but unforgotten. The empire built by Mughal kings thrived on art, architecture, and power. But it was built on the backs of women who paid with their freedom, their bodies, and often their lives.
They were queens in title, prisoners in truth. They lived in palaces, yet died in loneliness. They walked through halls of gold, but carried hearts heavy with silence. In the end, the Zenana was not just a secluded palace wing. It was a world where women were trapped in webs of politics, love, jealousy, and fear, forever remembered as ghostly figures behind latticed windows. Across the vast expanse of the African continent, where deserts stretch like oceans of gold, where rainforests hum with ancient whispers, where kingdoms once rose like storms and vanished like smoke, there lived queens whose fates were carved not in triumph, but in torment. Their stories did not travel easily through time. They were buried in oral histories interrupted by war, scattered by colonization, and smothered beneath the thunder of foreign narratives. Yet these women lived. They ruled. They suffered. They endured the cruelty of kings, the hunger for power, and the silent punishments hidden behind royal walls. Tonight, we open the gates to the forgotten palaces of Africa, and we breathe life into the stories of the tortured wives of kings most of the world never learned to pronounce. In African empires, from Congo to Benin, from Ethiopia to the Ashanti Kingdom, royal marriages were political tools. The wives of kings were not chosen for love, but for alliances, bloodlines, and divine symbolism. Their crowns were carved from tradition, their shackles from expectation. A queen might enter the palace with drums and dancing, but once the celebrations faded, she stepped into a reality where her every action was scrutinized. Her loyalty, her fertility, her obedience, her silence. If she fulfilled her role, she was praised as the mother of the nation. If she failed, she risked exile, public humiliation, or death. Royal women lived in constant fear of being replaced by younger wives, by political rivals, by concubines whose children might threaten the succession. Their suffering was woven into the very fabric of their crowns. In the Kingdom of Congo, marriage was a diplomatic battlefield. The king often took wives from rival clans, expecting peace in return, but peace rarely came. These wives lived under constant suspicion. They were watched, interrogated, sometimes beaten for imagined acts of treachery. If a king fell ill, a wife could be accused of witchcraft. If a prince rebelled, the queen mother could be blamed. If famine struck, the palace looked inward for a scapegoat. One tragic story tells of a queen accused of cursing the royal gardens because her child had died. In grief, she tore off her jewelry and begged to see her son's grave. Instead, she was dragged into the forest and left for the spirits to judge. Silence became her only legacy. The Ashanti Empire of present-day Ghana revered its queen mothers, the Ohema, yet royal wives often paid a steep price for proximity to the king. The deeper the king sank into spiritual rituals and political warfare, the more isolated his wives became. One queen, barely 16, was forced to undergo spiritual purification rituals whenever the king returned from battle. The purification was not gentle. It involved painful cleansing rites, days of silence, and forced isolation to wash away the spirits he brought with him. She lived surrounded by gold, but died surrounded by sorrow. Her name is lost to history, yet her suffering echoes through the centuries. In the ancient Benin kingdom, powerful kings, Obas, built palaces filled with art, ivory, and bronze that astonish historians even today. But the beauty of Benin's royal court hid a chilling truth. When the king died, his younger wives were expected to die with him. They were buried alive or sacrificed to accompany him into the afterlife. Their screams were muted by ritual chants. Their tears, mixed with sacred oils, poured over their heads. Some accepted it as destiny. Others tried to flee. Few succeeded. These women, taken as teenagers and trained to serve the Oba, were erased from the world the moment he exhaled his final breath. Their names were never carved into bronze. Their stories were never sung. Their suffering was swallowed by the earth.
The highlands of Ethiopia, ruled by emperors descended from Solomon himself, held stories of noble queens, wise, powerful, and politically influential. Yet many wives of kings were trapped in lives far from the glory history suggests. Princesses married off to powerful lords found themselves banished to remote castles in the mountains. There, they lived in cold stone chambers surrounded by guards who monitored their every movement. Their only crime was failing to produce a male heir. Some were forbidden from seeing their children. Some were locked away while their husbands took new brides. Some wasted away from loneliness so deep it felt like death long before their final breath. One Ethiopian queen was forced to walk barefoot across the highland stones as punishment for disobedience. Blood stained her path, but she never cried out. Silence was the only rebellion left to her. Unlike the brutal spectacles of European courts, the suffering of African queens was often invisible. There were no public executions, no trial records, no preserved letters of agony. Their torture was slow, emotional, spiritual. Isolation within palace compounds. Women were kept behind walls, guarded day and night
forbidden from speaking to outsiders. Ritual humiliation, from forced purifications to symbolic punishments for omens or misfortunes. Political silencing. If they questioned royal decisions, they were labeled disruptive, disloyal, or dangerous. Cultural expectations. They were expected to endure suffering with grace, to carry heartbreak without complaint, to die quietly if tradition demanded it. Behind the masks of ritual and royalty, human pain pulsed like a heartbeat. Yet not all royal wives remained silent victims. Some wielded influence through their sons. Some used spiritual knowledge to protect themselves. Some escaped. Some poisoned abusive kings. Some built alliances with palace servants and reshaped entire regions. A few rose to power, briefly, but even their triumphs were tainted with the memory of the chains they had to break.
Today, tourists marvel at African palaces, bronze sculptures, golden regalia, and ancient tombs, but they do not see the women who lived behind those artifacts. They do not hear the sobs in the night, the quiet prayers, the whispered pleas for mercy. But these queens lived, they survived, and their stories, though buried, are real. These women were not merely footnotes to kings. They were warriors of endurance, prisoners of tradition, and casualties of power. Their crowns were forged from suffering, their names lost, their lives forgotten. But tonight, we honor them. We remember them. We give them the space history denied them. The Forbidden City, a labyrinth of crimson walls, golden roofs, and silence so heavy it clings to the air like incense. A place where emperors ruled with absolute authority, where armies knelt, where dynasties rose and fell like the sweep of a calligrapher's brush. But beneath that breathtaking beauty lay a darker world, a world of whispers, shadows, and women whose lives were defined not by devotion, but by fear. Tonight, we walk into the inner palace, the home of empresses, concubines, and imperial wives whose names are carved into the deepest tragedies of the Ming and Qing dynasties. Their stories are not of love or honor, but of isolation, punishment, and spirits that were never allowed to rest. Inside the Forbidden City, the emperor's wives lived behind layers of walls and iron rules. They woke to palace bells, walked beneath lanterns that flickered like dying souls, and lived surrounded by attendants who might betray them with a single whispered lie. Women entered the palace as hopeful concubines or betrothed brides, but they quickly learned the first and most brutal truth. They were valuable only as long as they were useful. Birth a son, you gained influence. Fail to do so, you became invisible. But invisibility was better than the alternative: jealousy, accusation, and the punishments that followed. The palace was beautiful, yes, but beauty in the Forbidden City was a trap.
The Forbidden City wasn't simply divided by architecture, it was divided by power. At the top, the Empress, a woman crowned with responsibility but suffocated by expectation, often forced to discipline the concubines who competed for the emperor's attention. Below her, noble consorts, favored by the emperor, feared by all. Below them, consorts, attendants, servants, a vast web of women controlled by rules more rigid than stone. To rise was dangerous. To fall was fatal. A whispered rumor that a woman dishonored the emperor could mean exile to a cold, windowless room or a silk cord placed quietly around her neck. Punishments were rarely recorded. Deaths were often labeled illness. No one questioned. No one dared. And the walls, painted with dragons and phoenixes, absorbed every scream. One of the most haunting tragedies from the Ming Dynasty is the story of Empress Yu, a gentlewoman beloved by the people, but not by the emperor's powerful concubine, Lady Wan. Lady Wan, older and desperate to retain her fading influence, viewed Empress Yu as a threat. When the empress gave birth to a healthy son, panic consumed the court faction loyal to Lady Wan. Within weeks, the child fell mysteriously ill. Within days, he died. The empress was devastated. Lady Wan smiled behind her silk sleeves. Rumors say Empress Yu later fell ill herself. Another mysterious illness. Poison? Palace whispers said yes. History chose silence. The emperor never punished Lady Wan. He never questioned his child's death. In the Forbidden City, the truth often died with the women who spoke it.
During the Qing dynasty, the tradition of burying concubines with the emperor was still practiced, though often hidden behind ritual phrases like voluntary sacrifice. But many of these sacrifices were anything but voluntary. Lady Wang, a concubine of the Shunji emperor, suffered this fate. When the emperor died unexpectedly of smallpox, palace officials declared that his beloved concubine must follow him in loyalty. She was 21. She begged. She screamed. She fought until her nails bled. But the court had decided. Lady Wang was led to a sealed chamber beneath the palace. As the stone door closed, her sobs echoed in the darkness. Days later, the chamber was silent. Her spirit, they say, never left the palace. Workers in later centuries reported hearing soft crying behind the walls, a presence brushing past them in empty corridors, a shadow standing near the sealed room where she died. Inside the Forbidden City, ghosts were as real as emperors. One of the most chilling fates belonged to Empress Nara, the second wife of Emperor Qianlong. Initially adored for her calm intelligence, she was later cast aside when she refused to tolerate the emperor's new consorts. Her punishment was psychological torture. Qianlong ordered her hair to be cut, an unbearable humiliation in imperial China, her name removed from palace records, her rank stripped, her attendance dismissed, her contact with the emperor forbidden. She wandered the palace like a ghost, once an empress, now nothing. When she died, the emperor refused to grant her a proper burial. He denied her the honors owed to her position. He erased her from memory as though she had never lived. But inside the Forbidden City, her shadow lingered. Servants whispered that the empress's spirit appeared near mirrors, her long hair restored, her eyes filled with anguish. Because even in death, she sought the dignity stolen from her.
Punishments in the Forbidden City were designed to leave no marks, at least not on the skin. Some women were confined to dark rooms for months. Some were forced to kneel for hours on frozen tiles. Some were whipped with silk straps, soft enough not to bruise visibly, painful enough to break the mind. Others were denied food until they collapsed, denied sunlight until they lost their sense of time, denied human contact until they lost their grip on reality. And through it all, the emperor's decree was absolute. There were no appeals, no trials, no mercy.
The quiet cruelty of the Forbidden City was more effective than any blade. The Forbidden City is one of the most haunted places in the world. Tour guides speak softly of a woman in white wandering the gardens at dusk, a figure with no face gliding across the courtyards, the sound of silk footsteps in empty halls, crying heard near sealed rooms, shadows moving behind lanterns with no wind to sway them. These are said to be the spirits of concubines who died unnatural deaths, women who were punished for defiance, eliminated for jealousy, or silenced for knowing too much. Their stories were never recorded, yet their suffering lingers like the echo of a forgotten heartbeat. The Forbidden City was a masterpiece, a monument to imperial power, a testament to human artistry. But it was also a tomb for countless women whose dreams died inside its walls. They were married to gods, yet treated as shadows. They lived in palaces, yet died alone. They served an emperor, yet belonged to no one, not even themselves. Tonight, their stories rise again, not as ghosts hidden behind red walls, but as women whose lives deserve to be remembered. Spain, a land crowned with cathedrals piercing the sky, kingdoms forged in fire, and a royal bloodline wrapped in gold, war, and unwavering Catholic devotion. But inside its vast palaces, El Escorial, the Alcazar, the Alhambra, lived women who suffered quietly beneath the crushing expectations of the throne. Tonight, we open the doors to the royal chambers of Spain, where queens were not partners, not confidants, not even wives, but sacrifices to dynasties obsessed with power and purity. Their hearts were locked behind iron gates long before their bodies were. And among these tortured women, two names echo with the deepest sorrow. Joanna of Castile, known to history as Juana la Loca, and Isabella of Portugal, whose silence nearly destroyed a king. These queens were bound by the same chains, the chains of forbidden love, emotional starvation, and a crown that demanded their suffering. The tragedy of Joanna does not begin with madness. It begins with passion. Born to the legendary monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, Joanna grew up in a world where duty overshadowed affection, and politics sculpted every inch of a daughter's life. Yet Joanna was different from her siblings. She felt deeply, thought fiercely, and loved intensely. And that love became her downfall. At age 16, she was married off to Philip the Handsome, a man whose beauty captivated Europe, but whose heart was dangerously cold. Joanna fell for him instantly, a love so consuming it frightened those around her. She adored him with a devotion that left no space for caution.
But Philip, he loved her only when it pleased him. He flaunted his mistresses openly. He insulted her in front of diplomats. He used her passion as a weapon, provoking her jealousy to control her. Joanna's heart cracked in places no one could see. Each betrayal carved a new wound. Court members, eager to weaken her claim to power, whispered that she was unbalanced, too emotional, too passionate, too in love. Her grief became madness. Her tears became instability. Her devotion became dangerous. And when her mother died and Joanna inherited Castile, the men around her acted swiftly. Philip conspired to take her crown. Her father plotted to imprison her. Advisors painted her as a hysterical woman unfit to rule. Then Philip died suddenly. Some say a fever, others whispered darker causes. Joanna fell into a grief so deep it terrified the court. She followed his coffin across the kingdom. She refused to bury him for months. She prayed over his body at night, believing love could resurrect him. This was not madness. This was a woman shattered by betrayal, trapped by politics, and stripped of everyone she trusted. Ferdinand seized the chance to imprison his daughter. He locked her inside a convent in Tordesillas, a prison masked as sanctuary. For 46 years, Joanna remained locked away. Her hair turned white, her body weakened, her voice faded into whispers. Her crime? Loving too deeply in a world that punished women for love.
A century later, another Spanish queen would suffer a different torment, the torment of emotional abandonment. Isabella of Portugal, wife of the powerful Emperor Charles V, was known for her grace and intelligence. She was deeply devoted to her husband, and for a brief time he returned that devotion with equal warmth. But the Spanish throne was not built for love. It was built for empire. Charles was constantly away, campaigning, negotiating, ruling over a realm so vast it was said the sun never set on it. Isabella waited for him. She wrote letters filled with longing. She raised their children alone. She endured the crushing weight of royal expectation with quiet dignity. Years passed. Charles drifted further away, physically and emotionally. Isabella's loneliness deepened. When he finally returned, her joy swelled, but it was short-lived. She suffered a miscarriage, then another. Her health faltered. Her spirit dimmed. Finally, overwhelmed by isolation and heartbreak, she fell gravely ill. Charles hurried back, but it was too late. Isabella died at just 36, leaving Charles devastated. He locked himself away with her portraits, touched the letters she had written him, and whispered to her memory in a voice cracked with regret. Her death haunted him so deeply that he eventually abdicated the throne and spent his final years in a monastery, surrounded by relics of his lost wife. Isabella did not die from illness alone. She died from an emotional starvation inflicted by the crown.
Spain's royal tradition demanded queens be holy, silent, obedient, and, above all, emotionless. Love was a liability, desire a sin, attachment a threat to political neutrality. And so the Spanish monarchy destroyed any queen who dared to feel. Some were exiled. Some were slandered. Some were buried alive in rumors. Some were locked behind convent walls. Some, like Isabella, were simply left to wither. The crown did not want wives. It wanted symbols. Today, tourists walk through the Alhambra, the Royal Alcazar, and the Escorial without hearing the echoes. Joanna sobbing behind the convent door. Isabella praying for a husband who would abandon her. Fear trembling beneath the veils of unnamed consorts. Queens pacing marble floors in chambers that became cages. Spain's palaces are filled with art, tapestries, and gold, but also ghosts. Not supernatural ones, the ghosts of women erased by a kingdom that needed their silence. The marriages of Spanish monarchs were never meant to be tender. They were politics wearing wedding rings.
They were alliances signed in blood and sealed with suffering. And the queens? Young women stolen from their homelands, mothers forced into loneliness, wives denied affection, paid the highest price. They lived in palaces that gleamed under the sun, but inside, darkness swallowed their dreams. Tonight, their stories rise again, not as tragedies, but as warnings of what happens when a crown demands the death of a woman's heart.
The modern world loves to believe that royal suffering ended with the fall of ancient empires, that queens today walk freely through marble halls, protected by cameras, adored by crowds, liberated from the cages their ancestors endured. But the truth is more unsettling. Modern queens and princesses walk a new kind of prison, a palace built not of stone walls, but of expectations, media, and duty. A throne still chained to traditions that refuse to die, and a marriage that, once sealed for the sake of a nation, cannot be broken without shattering the illusion of perfection. Tonight, we drift away from medieval palaces and step into the bright but deceptive glow of modern monarchy, where women still pay with their hearts, their identities, and sometimes their lives. These are the wives trapped in a world where divorce is forbidden, where silence is mandatory, and where suffering is hidden behind designer gowns and public smiles. Centuries ago, kings punished wives with exile, imprisonment, poison, and execution. Today, the torture is no longer physical. It is psychological, emotional, invisible. A modern royal wife is expected to be a perfect mother, a perfect spouse, a national symbol, a diplomat, a role model, and above all, silent about her pain. Every step she takes is photographed, every word analyzed, every expression dissected. And if she struggles, the palace denies it, the tabloids devour it, the nation judges it. To be a modern queen is to live under a spotlight that burns hotter than any medieval torch.
The story of tortured modern queens begins, inevitably, with Diana Spencer. A young girl who entered Buckingham Palace not to be cherished, but to save the monarchy's image. Diana was 19. Charles was 32. Their marriage was arranged to heal a royal family losing touch with its people. But it did not heal. It destroyed her. From the moment she arrived, Diana realized something devastating. She was alone. Utterly, suffocatingly alone. Charles's heart belonged to another woman, Camilla, a shadow that haunted Diana's wedding, her honeymoon, her marriage bed. The crown expected Diana to accept this, to smile, to produce heirs, to remain silent. But Diana refused to die quietly inside the palace like queens before her. She spoke. She cried. She rebelled. She revealed the cracks in the throne that millions had never seen. She fought for her identity. She fought for love. She fought for a way out. And the more she fought, the more vicious the system became. The media turned her into prey. Paparazzi chased her like hunters chasing wounded deer. Every meal she skipped became a headline. Every tear became proof she was unstable. Every moment of vulnerability was twisted into scandal. Diana wanted a divorce. The crown resisted, not because of love, but because divorce threatened the monarchy's immaculate facade. When the palace finally allowed it, she paid with her title, her identity, and her safety. And in the end, she paid with her life.
Across the world, another woman faced torture of a different kind. Soraya, wife of the last Shah of Iran, was adored for her beauty and grace. But her marriage, like so many royal marriages, was a contract bound by one condition.
She must give the king a son. For 7 years she tried. Doctors prodded her. Courtiers judged her. Priests whispered that destiny had cursed her womb. The Shah loved her deeply, but love in royalty only matters if it produces heirs. When Soraya's infertility could no longer be concealed, the court pressured the Shah relentlessly. Take another wife, produce an heir. Your duty is to the throne, not to your heart. Soraya begged him not to. He begged destiny to change, but the monarchy would not bend. In 1958, the Shah divorced her. Soraya was forced to leave Iran, to leave her husband, to leave the future she had tried to build. She wrote later, "I lost my husband, and with him I lost everything." Her crown was taken not by enemies, but by her own biology. Her suffering came not from cruelty, but from tradition dressed as duty.
In Japan, the imperial family maintains the most restrictive monarchy of the modern world, and no woman suffered under its weight more than Princess Masako, wife of Crown Prince Naruhito. Masako was brilliant, a Harvard graduate, a diplomat, a woman who spoke 6 languages. But once she married into the imperial family, her voice was silenced. She was forbidden from working, forbidden from traveling freely, forbidden from expressing opinions. And like Soraya, she was tormented by expectations to produce a male heir. When she gave birth to a daughter, pressure only grew. The media hounded her. Courtiers restricted her every move. The strain broke her. Masako fell into deep depression, a condition the palace denied for years. She disappeared from public life, and Japan whispered that the imperial household had crushed her spirit. Even now, despite being empress, Masako moves under the weight of rules older than the stones of the palace she lives in. We often assume that modern queens are free, that they marry for love, that they can divorce, that they choose their destinies. But history repeats itself in quieter ways. Royal wives today face emotional isolation, media harassment, political silencing, institutional control, pressure to produce heirs, and marriages they cannot easily escape. The prisons are no longer built of stone. They are built of reputation, tradition, and relentless public scrutiny. Crowns may glitter, but the suffering they demand has never fully disappeared.
From Diana's hunted life, to Soraya's forced divorce, to Masako's quiet suffering, modern royal wives continue to fight battles no one sees. Battles against expectations, against institutions, against roles they cannot break without consequences that shake nations. Their torture is not medieval. It is psychological. It is emotional. It is silent. And often, it is permanent. The crown, the object kingdoms kill for, nations worship, armies die to protect, has always gleamed with temptation. But its shine hides the truth. Behind every crown is a woman whose suffering has been polished out of the official story, a queen whose tears evaporated before they could stain the royal archives, a wife who stood beside a king but lived beneath his shadow. And across every era, every continent, every empire, their stories repeat like a haunting chorus. Tonight, in this final chapter, we step back from individual tragedies and look at the pattern that binds them, a pattern older than kingdoms, older than palaces, older than monarchy itself. Because the throne was never built for women. It was built on them.
From Europe's frost-bitten castles to India's perfumed Zenanas, to Africa's sacred palaces, to China's forbidden chambers, to modern royal estates swarmed by cameras, the suffering of queens has always taken the same shape: obedience, silence, expectation, isolation, punishment. Queens were meant to be symbols, never humans. They were meant to smile, never doubt. They were meant to bear heirs, never complain. They were meant to inspire devotion, never ask for it themselves. The world adored them, but it refused to see the woman inside the crown. Every queen carried a burden carved from the same cold logic. If she was too quiet, she was weak. If she was outspoken, she was dangerous. If she was motherly, she was sentimental. If she was distant, she was cold. If she was beautiful, she invited jealousy. If she was plain, she lacked value. If she loved, she was foolish. If she did not love, she was heartless. No woman survived this paradox unscarred. Even in modern monarchies, the ideal queen is still expected to be a statue of grace, ageless, flawless, emotionless, existing purely to uphold the fantasy. But fantasies extract a price, and that price is always paid by the wife.
A king could be violent, unfaithful, unpredictable, paranoid, incompetent, or cruel. Yet the queen was still expected to hold the kingdom together. When a king failed, the queen was blamed. When a marriage failed, the queen was shamed. When a dynasty wavered, the queen was sacrificed. The wives of kings were punished not for their mistakes, but for their proximity to power. They were mirrors, reflecting the flaws of the men who ruled them. And mirrors that reflect too clearly are often shattered. In medieval Europe, a queen's fate depended on fertility. If she birthed sons, she survived. If she failed, she risked exile or execution. In the Ottoman Empire, the harem was a cage wrapped in silk, a world where women navigated intrigue sharp enough to kill. In the Mughal Zenanas, queens lived surrounded by luxury, but stripped of freedom, identity, and choice. In African palaces, royal wives were political hostages, sometimes guarded, sometimes sacrificed, always scrutinized. In the Forbidden City, punishment came without trial, and death without justice. A concubine could be buried alive with her emperor or vanish into a dark hall never to be seen again. In modern monarchies, emotional pain replaced physical torture. Diana hunted by paparazzi. Soraya discarded for infertility. Masako crushed by silence and expectation. The palaces looked different, the punishments evolved, but the suffering remained the same. Because monarchy, at its core, was never designed to protect women. It was designed to use them.
There is a reason royal wives suffered more than royal husbands. A king's power freed him. A queen's power imprisoned her. A king could defy expectation, take mistresses, break alliances, start wars, change laws. A queen had only one choice: to obey. She could not run. She could not divorce. She could not refuse. She could not scream. She could not rebel without risking her life or her children's. Her freedom ended where the kingdom's needs began. To be a queen was to live a life written by others, a life where every moment served the crown, never the woman behind it. And when a queen's usefulness ended, so did her protection. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is this: queens were worshipped in public and forgotten in private, praised in ceremonies, ignored in their suffering, immortalized in paintings, erased in their pain, idealized in myth, silenced in history. The world adored the symbol of the queen, but abandoned the woman who bore the weight.
Yet despite everything, the neglect, the humiliation, the abandonment, the imprisonment, the fear, the violence, these women endured. Isabel fought back and overthrew a king. Anne Boleyn died, but birthed a future monarch. Marfa Sobakina's tragedy reshaped Russia. Hurrem rose from slavery to political power. Marie Antoinette died with dignity the revolution could not destroy. Mughal brides shaped empires from behind lattice screens. African queens resisted erasure through quiet strength. Forbidden City concubines left legacies no emperor could silence. Joanna survived nearly half a century in captivity. Isabella of Portugal shaped her husband's legacy even in death. Diana changed the monarchy forever. Soraya walked away with grace. Masako stands today as empress, still fighting, but still unbroken. These were not weak women. These were women forced into impossible roles, and still they endured long enough for history to remember them. Across this series, we have walked into palaces where queens whispered their final prayers, into chambers where they slept alone, into courts where they were judged harshly and punished quietly. But tonight, something changes. The queens whose names were erased are spoken again. The brides who were silenced are heard again. The women who suffered so kings could rule are remembered again. Their stories do not belong to the kings who overshadowed them. Their stories belong to them, to the women who survived the throne's hunger. The crown devoured their peace, their love, their hope, their lives, but it did not devour their legacy. For as long as their stories are told, their suffering becomes more than tragedy. It becomes truth. It becomes warning. It becomes memory. And memory is a kind of justice.